My son blocked the doorway with both arms and said, "Dad, you are not coming in while my wife's family is here." I stood there looking at my own son, guarding my own doorway. That is when I realized the blood tie was entirely dead. And that was the moment my silent retaliation began. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The afternoon sun beat down on the paved driveway of my suburban estate. I had spent the entire morning in the detached garage running heavy cedar planks through the table saw. The smell of fresh sawdust and motor oil clung to my denim jacket. At 70 years old, physical labor kept my mind sharp and my body strong. I wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of my hand and walked toward the main house to get a cold glass of water. I reached the front porch and extended my hand toward the solid brass handle. The heavy oak door swung open before my fingers could make contact. David stood dead center in the frame. His arms were spread wide, his hands gripping both sides of the doorframe like a barricade. He wore a pressed navy suit, his hair meticulously styled. Behind his right shoulder stood his wife, Monica. She wore a pristine white silk blouse and clutched a crystal wine glass. Her face contorted in absolute disgust as her eyes swept over my sawdust-covered boots and stained work jeans. David swallowed hard and physically blocked my path. He told me I needed to turn around and get back in my truck. He said Monica's parents, Gerald and Sylvia Knox, had arrived early from the East Coast for their weekend visit. He said they were already in the living room unpacking their luxury luggage. I looked past his shoulder and saw the glint of expensive coats draped over the entryway bench. Monica stepped closer to my son and spoke in a sharp, clipped tone. She said they could not have me walking through the house looking like a homeless vagrant. She explicitly stated that her parents expected a certain high society standard of living. She instructed David to give me some cash and send me to a roadside motel until Monday morning. She refused to let my shabby appearance ruin the perfect aristocratic image she had meticulously crafted for her wealthy parents. David reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a crumpled $50 bill. He held it out to me with a trembling hand. He told me to go take a long drive, find a cheap place off the highway, and stay out of sight for the next 3 days. He commanded me not to call the house phone because they would be busy entertaining their important guests. I did not shout. I did not slap the money out of his trembling hand. I simply looked down at my own hands. My knuckles were scarred and coated in a thin layer of machine grease. The calluses on my palms were thick and permanent. Monica saw dirt. David saw a shameful embarrassment. They did not see the truth. These specific hands had spent 4 decades drafting the complex structural blueprints for the massive steel suspension bridges that connected this entire state. These hands had calculated load-bearing limits and managed multi-million-dollar infrastructure budgets. These hands had held the pen that signed a massive cashier's check to buy this exact 2-acre property in full without a single mortgage exactly 40 years ago. Every brick, every wooden beam, every blade of grass they were currently standing on belonged entirely to me. I had allowed David to put his name on the deed alongside mine after his mother passed away. It was a foolish, emotional decision born from the blind grief of a widowed father wanting to secure his only son's future. It was a massive mistake I was now going to rectify. I looked David directly in the eyes. I searched for a shred of guilt or hesitation. I saw nothing. I saw only the desperate, pathetic need to please a wife who manipulated his every move. I nodded once. I turned on my heel and walked down the brick pathway. I heard the heavy front door slam shut behind me. I heard the deadbolt click firmly into place. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded an obsolete burden. I did not walk to my truck. I walked around the perimeter of the manicured lawn, intentionally staying out of sight of the large bay windows. I reached the back of the house and descended the concrete steps leading to the cellar door. The basement had become my designated exile zone ever since Monica moved in 2 years ago. She had immediately claimed the upper floors for her lavish minimalist lifestyle and banished my personal belongings to the subterranean level. I unlocked the exterior cellar door and stepped into the cool, dark space. The basement was quiet. I walked down the narrow corridor toward my private office. This room was my sanctuary. It was secured by a heavy, solid oak door that I had installed myself. No one was permitted inside, and my son knew the boundary well. I stopped dead in my tracks. The thick brass lock on the oak door was completely shattered. Sharp splinters of wood littered the hallway floor. Deep gouge marks scarred the doorframe, where a heavy iron crowbar had been violently jammed into the gap. Someone had deliberately and aggressively smashed their way into my private office. I pushed the ruined door open. The interior of the room had been aggressively ransacked. Every file cabinet was pulled open. Stacks of engineering schematics and old tax returns were scattered across the floor like worthless trash. But my eyes immediately locked onto the far corner of the room. My heavy steel safe had been forced open. The thick metal door hung ajar, its internal locking mechanism completely drilled out and destroyed. I stepped over the debris and crouched in front of the ruined safe. I systematically checked the contents. My late wife's diamond jewelry was untouched. The stacks of emergency cash I kept in the corner were completely ignored. They had not come down here searching for petty theft. They were hunting for something far more valuable. I ran my fingers along the bottom shelf of the safe. The thick manila envelope containing the original property deed to the estate was gone. My heart beat with a slow, dangerous rhythm. I stood up and scanned the chaotic room. I noticed a single sheet of paper lying half-hidden beneath my overturned leather desk chair. It must have fallen from their hands in their frantic rush to secure the stolen documents. I picked it up and held it toward the desk lamp. It was a bank receipt from a prominent lending institution. The header clearly stated it was a home equity line of credit application. The requested loan amount was exactly $300,000. I stared at the signature line at the bottom of the page. My name was written there, but the handwriting was completely wrong. The letters were soft looping and overly stylized. It was Monica's handwriting. She had meticulously forged my signature to leverage my entire estate for a massive, unauthorized cash loan. I folded the receipt and placed it securely into my breast pocket. The pain of my son barring me from my own front door vanished entirely. It was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. They had crossed the line from ungrateful disrespect into federal financial crime. I walked over to my secondary desk, moved a stack of dusty structural engineering books, and revealed a hidden digital monitor. 5 years ago, after a string of burglaries in our neighborhood, I had installed high-definition security cameras in every common area of the house. I activated the screen. The live video feed showed the main living room directly above my head. David and Monica were sitting on the plush leather sofas, clinking crystal champagne glasses with Gerald and Sylvia Knox. They were toasting to their brilliant financial success. They were openly celebrating the hundreds of thousands of dollars they had just stolen from an old man they assumed was too stupid to notice. They genuinely believed I was currently driving down the highway, searching for a cheap motel to hide my shame. They had no idea I was sitting directly beneath their feet, holding the physical evidence that would ultimately send them all to federal prison. The war had officially begun, and I was going to ensure their total destruction. I stepped through this ruined doorway, and the metallic tang of sheared iron hit the back of my throat. My private office was a desecrated sanctuary. The heavy oak door I had meticulously hung and balanced 20 years ago was reduced to splintered kindling at the hinges. They had not simply picked the lock. They had used a heavy-duty pry bar to violently wedge the frame apart. The sheer physical aggression required to tear through 2 inches of solid hardwood spoke volumes about their desperation. Drawers from my steel filing cabinets were yanked off their internal tracks and thrown haphazardly across the Persian rug. Decades of meticulously organized structural schematics, bridge blueprints, and old tax returns were scattered like dead leaves after a storm. I did not gasp. I did not shout in anger. My heart settled into a slow and steady rhythm, A lifetime of diagnosing catastrophic mechanical failures had trained me to detach my emotions when facing a disaster. You do not panic when a turbine catches fire. You calmly shut off the fuel valve. Right now, my own son was the fire. I walked carefully over the sea of scattered paper and approached the far corner of the room. My floor safe sat heavily against the concrete foundation. It was a vintage cast-iron model built to withstand a 3-story drop and extreme heat. But it was not built to withstand a betrayal from someone who knew its exact structural vulnerabilities. The thick, circular door was swung wide open. I crouched down and ran my calloused thumb over the locking mechanism. The internal tumblers had been aggressively drilled out with a titanium carbide bit. I recognized the precise angle of the drill hole. Someone had used my own heavy-duty power tools from the garage to break into my secure vault. I systematically audited the remaining contents. My late wife's velvet jewelry boxes sat untouched on the top shelf. The emergency stacks of $100 bills I kept bound in rubber bands were completely ignored. Thieves motivated by simple greed would have grabbed the cash and run. Colin and Monica were not petty thieves. They were hunting for leverage. I slid my hand into the hidden compartment at the very bottom of the safe. My fingers met empty air. The thick manila envelope was gone. That envelope contained the original unencumbered property deed to this estate. It was the only financial document in my entire portfolio that bore my son's name alongside my own. I had made that specific legal arrangement exactly 10 years ago, mere weeks after burying my wife. Grief is a blinding and dangerous condition. It strips away your logic and replaces it with a desperate need to cling to whatever family you have left. In my darkest hour of mourning, I sat in a sterile legal office and voluntarily added Colin as a joint tenant with right of survivorship on the primary residence. I wanted to ensure he would never have to deal with a lengthy probate court battle if my heart suddenly gave out from the sorrow. I wanted him to feel secure. I wanted him to know this land would always be his home. I had handed him the keys to his future out of pure, unconditional paternal love. I never anticipated that he would use those same keys to lock me out and sell the ground right from under my feet. By holding joint tenancy, Colin possessed partial legal authority over the physical property. But he absolutely did not possess the unilateral right to leverage the entire estate without my explicit notarized consent. I stood up and slowly scanned the devastation around me. When amateurs commit a crime in a frantic hurry, they always leave a trace of their incompetence behind. My eyes tracked the chaotic path of destruction from the safe to my overturned leather desk chair. Peeking out from beneath the heavy wooden leg of the desk was a single sheet of crisp white paper. It did not belong to my files. My documents were printed on heavy off-white architectural stock. This was cheap standard printer paper. I crouched down, pulled the sheet from the shadows, and held it up to the harsh light of my desk lamp. It was a final approval statement from a prominent national lending institution. The bold black letters across the top of the page spelled out, "Home Equity Line of Credit." My eyes tracked down the columns of standardized banking text. The approved loan amount was $500,000. I stared at that number. $500,000 extracted directly from the equity of my home. My gaze dropped to the bottom right corner of the document. 2 signatures were required to authorize a loan of this magnitude against a jointly owned property. Colin's signature was there hastily scrawled in black ink. Right beside it, resting perfectly on the dotted line, was my own name. I traced the ink of my forged signature with my index finger. The person who signed my name had clearly practiced, but they lacked the stiff, angular precision of a man who had spent 40 years drafting technical engineering blueprints. The letters were too soft. The curves of the capital letters were overly stylized and looping. The pen pressure was entirely wrong, betraying a light feminine grip. I knew that handwriting intimately. I had seen it on countless superficial holiday cards and passive-aggressive grocery lists. Monica had personally forged my signature to steal $500,000 from my estate. She had committed a severe federal crime and my son had stood right beside her as an active accomplice. The pieces of their sickening puzzle snapped together with flawless mechanical precision. The sudden, unannounced arrival of her wealthy, bankrupt parents, the urgent need to banish me to a cheap roadside motel for the weekend, the aggressive barricade at the front door. The $500,000 had not simply vanished into the ether. It had been systematically extracted to fund the grand illusion of the Knox family empire. Gerald and Sylvia Knox were drowning in their own financial ruin, and Monica had decided to use my life's work as a personal rescue fund for her pathetic, status-obsessed parents. They had calculated that I was just a tired old man who would eventually surrender to their demands. They assumed I would be too intimidated by the complex banking documents to fight back. They genuinely believed I would retreat into the shadows, accept my defeat, and quietly transition into whatever miserable nursing home they eventually selected for me. I carefully folded the forged bank document and slid it securely into the inner pocket of my denim jacket. A profound silence settled over the ruined office. I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow. The father who would have wept for his son's broken moral compass had died the moment Colin blocked the front door. The man standing in the basement was a retired heavy engineer who fundamentally understood that when a structure is irreparably compromised by rot, you do not try to patch it with paint. You completely demolish the corrupted foundation and let the building collapse on top of the parasites living inside. I reached for my phone. I needed to move swiftly, silently, and with absolute legal brutality. My family had drawn the battle lines using fraud and deceit. I was going to finish the war with the crushing, inescapable weight of the truth. The heavy oak floorboards above my head groaned under a weight I knew all too well. It was a rhythmic, arrogant stride, the unmistakable gait of Gerald Knox. He was walking directly toward my private office. My heart did not accelerate. It slowed, falling into the steady, mechanical cadence of a man who had survived collapsed mine shafts and bridge failures. I had seconds. If Gerald found me in this office, the game would end before it truly began. I turned the heavy brass deadbolt from the inside just as a hand tried the door handle. It rattled violently, then a muffled voice cursed from the hallway, a sound of impatience that made my blood run cold. I slipped through the narrow coal chute that led out behind the house. My aged joints protested against the damp concrete, but my determination far outweighed the physical discomfort. I pulled my work jacket tight around my chest, hiding the forged loan document that burned against my ribs. I scrambled into the overgrown rhododendrons, staying low to the ground as I sprinted toward the rear gate where my old pickup truck was parked. I did not drive to the main road. I cut through the back alleyways, navigating the familiar labyrinth of the neighborhood I had mapped in my mind 1,000 times over the last 4 decades. I reached the Grand Imperial Hotel downtown just as the city lights began to flicker to life. The receptionist gave me a strange look as I checked in wearing my soiled work clothes, but I did not care. I paid cash for a week in the top-floor suite, a room that cost more than David earned in a month, and hurried inside. I did not look at the plush decor or the expansive view of the city skyline. I went straight to the desk and opened my laptop. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I did not just have a simple savings account. I had been a lead structural engineer for the most prestigious multinational firm in the country for 30 years. I had consulted on projects that spanned 3 continents. While David grew up believing we were living paycheck to paycheck, I had been quietly channeling every bonus, every speaking fee, and every patent royalty into a diversified global portfolio. My wife and I had lived a life of deliberate, almost monastic simplicity because we knew the corrosive nature of unearned wealth. We wanted David to understand the value of $1, not the weight of it. It seemed I had been too successful at shielding him from the reality of our true position. I logged into my primary server. A dashboard appeared on the screen, flickering to life with a series of blue dots representing various locations. I had installed a closed-circuit surveillance system throughout the house 5 years ago. It was an engineering masterclass. I had cameras hidden in smoke detectors, motion sensors disguised as crown molding, and microphones embedded in the very walls. I had originally built it to monitor contractors during the last renovation, but it had sat dormant since. I activated the feed. The screen blinked and suddenly my own living room materialized in high definition. The audio feed hissed before stabilizing. The scene was sickening. David and Monica were lounging on my leather sofas, their legs kicked up onto the coffee table. Gerald and Sylvia Knox were sitting in my armchairs, glasses of champagne in their hands. They were celebrating. They were laughing. The sound of their voices filtered through my speakers, sharp and clear. I heard Gerald say that the loan was approved, that the money would hit their corporate account by Monday morning. I watched them toast to my ignorance. I watched my own son laugh as he joked about how easy it was to manipulate his old man. My hands remained steady on the mouse, but my skin felt tight, drawn like the cables of a suspension bridge under maximum load. They thought they had left me with nothing. They thought I was driving down the highway, worried about how I would pay for a cheap motel room. They had no idea that I was sitting directly beneath their feet, holding the physical evidence that would ultimately send them all to federal prison. They were not just my son and his wife anymore. They were the architects of their own inevitable downfall, and I was the engineer who was about to pull the lever. I watched David lean over and kiss Monica on the forehead, the sickening display of affection, only fueling the fire in my veins. He mentioned needing to pick up the final set of forged documents from the notary on Monday morning. That was the missing piece. He was going to walk right into a trap that I had already set in motion with the help of my lawyer. I spent the next hour pulling up every file related to the property. My late wife had kept meticulous records of the house construction, every invoice for materials, every permit, every payment she had made from her own inheritance. I was not just a homeowner. I was the legal architect of this entire life. My son was playing a game of poker with a man who had written the rulebook. I began to draft an email to Stephen, my lawyer, detailing the exact location of the security servers and the timestamp of the incriminating conversation. We needed to ensure that when the police arrived, they did not just find the forgery, they needed to find the intent. Every laugh that emanated from my speakers was a nail in their coffins. I watched Sylvia adjust her designer necklace, a piece I had bought for my wife 30 years ago at an auction in London. It was stolen from the safe, likely by Monica, while I was at work. I recorded the timestamp of that visual confirmation. Theft was another charge to add to the list. I sat in the darkness of the hotel suite, illuminated only by the glow of the monitors. I felt the weight of my 70 years, but for the first time in a long time, the weight was not one of sadness, but of purpose. They had broken into my office to destroy my legacy, but they had inadvertently handed me the tools to burn their future to the ground. I had all the time in the world to wait for them to make the next mistake. And I knew with the arrogance they displayed, the next mistake was only a matter of minutes away. The feed showed David getting up to get another bottle of wine from the kitchen. He walked past my old family portrait on the wall, the one where he looked so innocent, so full of promise. He did not even glance at it. He simply poured the champagne and kept laughing. I watched and I calculated. I would not let them enjoy a single drop of that ill-gotten wine. The morning would come, and the reality I had prepared would be much harsher than any hangover they could imagine. I watched the monitor until my eyes burned. The high-definition feed showed my living room bathed in the warm amber glow of the fireplace I had built with my own hands. My son David sat hunched on the leather sofa, cradling a glass of scotch, like a man waiting for a death sentence to be commuted. Beside him, Monica sat with a posture of practiced elegance, her eyes scanning the room, as if she were already measuring the square footage for her next renovation. They were entertaining her parents, Gerald and Sylvia Knox. The air in the room seemed thick with the scent of expensive stolen perfume and cheap, rotting morality. I leaned closer to the screen. Richard Knox stood by my bookshelf, swirling a glass of vintage wine that I had been saving for a truly special occasion. He was holding court, his voice booming through the speakers with that affected accent he used whenever he wanted to sound much richer than he actually was. He was talking about his company, the Knox Investment Group, describing it as an empire on the rise, a titan of industry poised for massive international expansion. I listened to his words, and I felt the gears in my mind begin to turn. I am a structural engineer. I know how to read blueprints, and I know how to spot a flaw in the load-bearing walls of any structure. I listened to his boasts, and the logic simply did not hold. If Richard Knox were truly a titan of industry, he would not be sitting in my living room celebrating a $500,000 loan secured against a suburban residence. Men who manage massive corporate portfolios do not leverage the equity of a retired engineer's home to fund their expansion. It was a structural flaw in their entire scam. He was bragging about an empire, but his foundation was made of sand. They were desperate, not powerful. They were drowning in debt and needed my life's work to stay afloat for a few more months before the inevitable bankruptcy swallowed them whole. Monica cut into the conversation, her voice sharp and impatient. She complained that the loan money was barely enough to cover the interest on their existing obligations. She said the business opportunities in Europe were slipping through their fingers, and they needed a much larger capital injection immediately. I watched her mother Sylvia lean forward, her face a mask of cold, calculating greed. She suggested that borrowing against the house was merely a stopgap. She said they needed total, unfettered access to all of my accounts, my retirement funds, and my long-term savings. Then came the part that turned my blood to ice. Victoria Montgomery, Monica's mother, set her glass down on my mahogany coffee table with a soft click. She looked directly at David, then glanced at the hallway that led toward the master bedroom. She lowered her voice, but the house microphones picked it up perfectly. She said that as long as I remained the legal owner and the one managing the money, they would always be restricted. She said they needed to prove that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. She suggested that they find a doctor, a specialist, willing to sign a formal evaluation of dementia or early-onset cognitive decline. She said if they could officially declare me mentally incompetent, they would be appointed as my legal guardians, giving them complete unchecked control over every penny I had ever earned. I sat in the darkness of the hotel suite, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle into my bones. For years I had worried that David was simply a young man who had lost his way, someone I could eventually guide back to the right path. I was wrong. He was not lost. He was a willing participant in a predatory scheme to erase his own father. They did not just want my house. They did not just want my money. They wanted to dismantle my identity. They wanted to legally delete me from existence so they could feast on the remains of my life. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight, but the adrenaline pulsing through my veins made sleep an impossibility. I pulled out my laptop and began to systematically organize every piece of digital evidence I had accumulated. I needed to act before they could find that cooperative doctor. I had to force them into a position where their own arrogance became their downfall. They thought I was a senile old man who would be easy to manipulate. They were about to learn that the man who designed the bridges they drove across every day did not tolerate structural weaknesses in his personal life. I began drafting an email to Stephen Foster, my lawyer. I laid out the plan, the timeline, and the specific traps we were going to set. I watched the monitor again. David and Monica were now standing by the window, kissing, laughing about how much better the house would look once I was gone. They were dancing on the edge of a precipice, and they did not even know that I was the one holding the ground beneath their feet. Every laugh, every conspiratorial whisper, every moment of their cold-hearted greed was being recorded, archived, and prepared for the moment of their destruction. I took a deep breath and closed the monitor. The stage was set. Tomorrow I would begin the final phase of my correction. They wanted me to be incompetent, so I would play the role to perfection, right up until the moment I pulled the rug out from under them. The city lights blurred behind the hotel window, but I did not see them. I only saw the face of my son on the computer screen. I did not call the police because that would be a knee-jerk reaction. Calling the police now would be like throwing a pebble at a hornet nest. I needed to burn the entire tree. I pulled a secure phone from my jacket and dialed the number of Stephen Foster. He was more than a lawyer. He was a veteran of the courtroom and a man who owed me his life. Years ago, he had been trapped in a collapsing construction site I managed. I was the one who crawled through the rubble to pull him out when the structural integrity gave way. He never forgot. He picked up on the first ring. I opened my laptop and initiated a secure video call. Stephen looked tired as the screen flickered to life, but his eyes sharpened the moment I held the forged bank documents up to the camera. He listened in complete silence as I recounted the events of the evening. When I described the conversation I had recorded between my son and his mother-in-law, he did not speak for a long time. He knew as well as I did that a simple police report would be a mistake. David would fold immediately if the sirens started wailing. He would point the finger at Monica. He would claim he was a victim of her manipulation. I did not want David to escape the consequences by playing the victim. I wanted to expose the depth of his rot. I wanted to show that he was a willing participant in every single step of this deception. Stephen looked at me through the screen and shook his head slowly. He agreed that we had to proceed with caution. He told me the law was a blunt instrument that was meant to crush the pride of people like the Montgomery family. If we brought the authorities in now, we would get a quick arrest, but we would lose the chance to see the full scope of their entitlement. We needed to let them reveal their true colors. I agreed with his assessment. To dismantle their arrogance, I had to become the very thing they wanted me to be. I had to play the part of a senile old man who was losing his grip on reality. It was a role I detested, but it was the only way to lure them into the trap they were preparing. Stephen warned me that the medical trap was the most dangerous part of their plan. They would bring in a doctor to certify my incompetence. I told him I was ready. I told him I knew how to act confused. I knew how to stutter. I knew how to look into space as if I were forgetting my own name. We ended the call with a clear plan of action. I had to go back. I had to walk through that front door and smile while they plotted my legal demise. I had to let them think they were closing the net around me. They thought I was a fragile old man with no fight left. They had no idea that beneath this gray hair and these wrinkled hands was the mind of a structural engineer who understood that the strongest buildings were the ones that looked the simplest from the outside. I put the laptop away and stared at the reflection in the dark glass. I was going back into the belly of the beast. I would eat their dinner. I would listen to their insults. And every second I spent under that roof would be a second closer to their total ruin. The game was no longer about money. It was about teaching my son that you cannot build a life on the foundation of a father betrayal. The Sunday afternoon sun hung heavy and stagnant in the sky. I stood before the iron gate of my own estate, the cold metal biting into my calloused palms. I allowed my posture to dissolve. I dropped my shoulders into a familiar, tired hunch. I let my breathing become shallow and slightly labored. I was no longer the engineer who had spent the night in a luxury hotel suite planning their demise. I was the old man exhausted by a weekend of aimless wandering, returning to the only home he had ever known. I pushed the gate open. The house stood before me, a monument to a life of labor now colonized by vultures. I walked slowly up the brick path, deliberately kicking up a small cloud of dust to suggest I had been walking for miles. David stood on the porch, waiting. His face was a mask of irritation, his jaw set, his eyes darting impatiently toward the driveway, as if he were wishing I would simply vanish into thin air. He did not ask where I had been. He did not ask if I had eaten. He simply watched me with the detached annoyance one might reserve for a stray animal that had wandered too close to the property line. I climbed the porch steps with a slight stumble. David did not reach out to steady me. He stepped aside, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if my very presence caused him physical pain. I stepped into the foyer. The house was unnaturally quiet, stripped of its warmth, and replaced by the sterile, expensive scent of lilies and high-end floor wax. Victoria Montgomery sat in the wingback chair by the fireplace. She was draped in designer linen that looked like it cost more than a year of my pension. She looked up from her book, her eyes scanning me with the same look of clinical disgust that a doctor might reserve for an incurable wound. "Oh, you are back," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. We were beginning to worry. "David, get your father some water. He looks absolutely exhausted." She didn't mean a word of it. Her concern was as paper-thin as the gold plating on the watch I saw gleaming on Richard Montgomery's wrist as he stepped out of the study. I froze for a fraction of a second. Richard was holding a tumbler of scotch, his left hand resting on the back of the sofa. The light from the chandelier caught the watch face, and there it was. A tiny, almost microscopic fleck of silver-colored base metal shone through a scratch near the crown. The gold plating was flaking away. It was a fake. A high-quality imitation, perhaps, but a fake nonetheless. Everything about them was a lie. The wealth, the status, the corporate empire they claimed to rule. It was all a brittle veneer of gold leaf over cheap, corroded metal. They weren't titans. They were desperate grifters trying to pass off their own poverty as prestige. I felt a surge of cold, sharp amusement. I was standing in a room full of ghosts. I was the only thing in this house that was actually real. I turned my attention back to Victoria. I looked as confused and tired as I could manage. My vision seemed to lose focus as I stared at the carpet. I let my hands shake a little. It was an easy performance. David returned with a glass of water, his movements jerky and impatient. "Drink this," he said, pressing the glass into my hand. "You look like you're about to collapse." I took the glass, my fingers trembling intentionally against the cold surface. I brought it to my lips, and then, as if my grip had suddenly failed, I let it slip. The glass struck the marble tabletop with a loud, sharp crack. Water splashed everywhere, soaking the expensive rug and the stack of magazines Richard had left on the table. David swore under his breath and lunged forward with a towel. "You clumsy old fool," he spat, the words escaping before he could catch them. He realized his mistake instantly. He looked at Victoria, then at me, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. I stared at the water pooling on the floor, blinking slowly, as if I didn't quite understand how the glass had ended up there. My expression was vacant. I was a man who had suddenly lost his way in his own living room. Victoria sighed, a long, dramatic exhale of a woman enduring a terrible burden. She signaled to David. Her eyes were hard, her lips thin. She didn't look at me with sympathy. She looked at me with the same cold, analytical hunger of a predator spotting an injured limb. "David," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "This confirms what we were talking about earlier. His health is clearly failing. His motor skills are slipping. He is not just confused. He is dangerous to himself." David looked at me, his eyes wide and bright with a frantic, greedy relief. He finally had the excuse he needed. He had the proof. He didn't see a father who had slipped. He saw a check mark on a list. He saw the doors of the bank vault swinging open. "Yes, Victoria," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You are right. This cannot go on. We need to do something immediately." I continued to stare at the wet rug, my breathing ragged. I let my jaw go slack. I let the confusion take over my features. It was a simple act, a performance of infirmity that felt almost like an insult to my own intelligence. But it was working. They were eating it up. They were so blinded by the prospect of the inheritance that they couldn't see the man behind the mask. David placed a firm hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a comforting hand. It was the hand of a jailer. "Dad," he said, trying to infuse his voice with a false saccharine tenderness, "we have talked to a doctor, a specialist. He is going to come to the house tomorrow morning to perform a thorough evaluation. We just want to make sure you are safe. We just want to be sure you are getting the care you deserve." Care. The word tasted like poison. I looked up at him, my eyes glassed over with feigned disorientation. I nodded slowly, a rhythmic, empty motion. "If that is what you think is best, David," I whispered. "I don't want to be a trouble to anyone. I don't want to be a burden." David's grip on my shoulder tightened. His knuckles turned white. "It's not a burden, Dad," he lied, his voice thick with the weight of his own deception. "It's family. We are just doing what family does. We are taking care of our own. I kept my head bowed, hiding the sharp, predatory gleam in my eyes. They were leading me exactly where I wanted to go. They thought they were trapping me in a cage of their own design, but they were actually walking straight into the heart of the trap I had spent the last 24 hours perfecting. Tomorrow morning, when that doctor walked through the door, he would not be finding a confused old man. He would be finding the end of the Montgomery family's reign of lies. I sat back in my armchair, feeling the damp fabric beneath me. I didn't reach for another towel. I didn't try to clean the mess. I sat still, motionless, a piece of furniture in my own home, while they stood around me, buzzing like flies over a feast they hadn't even begun to digest yet. They were already spending money they didn't have, planning a future that didn't belong to them. And all the while I was right there, the architect of their silence, listening to every word, waiting for the first light of dawn. The game was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Dr. Evans arrived at 10 in the morning, sharp. He was a man of medium height, with skin the color of old parchment, and eyes that darted around the room like nervous insects. He carried a leather medical bag that looked worn and scuffed at the corners. He introduced himself with a voice that sounded like sandpaper rubbing against gravel. He explained that my son David had requested a routine cognitive assessment to ensure my safety and well-being. I nodded slowly. I sank into the armchair and let my posture sag until I looked like a man who had long ago forgotten how to hold himself upright. I kept my gaze unfocused and dim. I was the perfect stage for his performance. He sat down across from me and opened his notebook with a flourish. He started the evaluation with a series of simple questions designed to expose a mind that he assumed was failing. He asked me to name the current president of the country. I blinked several times, as if trying to dredge the information from a murky depth. I looked at the ceiling and muttered a name from 4 years ago. He smiled. It was a thin, predatory line that barely moved his lips. He scribbled something on his pad with vigorous strokes. He asked me to name the last 3 objects he had pointed to in the room. I pointed toward the window, then the bookshelf, then the floor, purposely getting 2 out of the 3 wrong. I watched him. He was becoming more confident with every mistake I made. He wasn't just observing. He was actively hunting for evidence of my decline. He pulled a small clock from his bag and asked me to draw the face of it and set the time to 10 minutes past 11. I drew a lopsided circle, placed the numbers in a chaotic, scrambled sequence, and put the hands in a position that made no sense. He sighed, a dramatic display of fake empathy. He took the paper and shook his head as if he were mourning a tragedy. He was already drafting the verdict in his mind. He was already spending the $10,000 he had been promised for this hit job. As he reached across the desk to put his pen away, the sunlight caught the metal pinned to his chest. It was a gold-plated tie clip shaped exactly like a miniature roulette wheel with a tiny ruby set in the center. I recognized the emblem. It was the logo for the Gilded Cage, the most notorious underground casino in this part of the state. It was a place that catered to men who had lost their fortunes and were desperately looking to claw them back. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Evans was not just a doctor. He was a gambler who had likely lost everything. He was desperate and broken. That was why they chose him. A man like that is far easier to bribe than a man with a moral compass. He wasn't a professional. He was a mercenary. He asked me to stay seated while he went to the hallway to speak with David. He said he needed to discuss his preliminary findings. He left his notepad wide open on the desk. He didn't even bother to close it. He assumed I didn't have the presence of mind to be curious. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the door with the arrogant stride of a man who believes he is the smartest person in the room. He didn't look back. He didn't notice the change in my expression as soon as the door clicked shut. I didn't reach for my cane. I didn't stumble. I leaned over the desk with the silent speed of a predatory bird. My hand was steady as I grabbed my phone. I didn't just take one picture. I took 3 from different angles to ensure the lighting caught every stroke of his pen. The notes were written in a jagged, aggressive script. I could see every word. Mental incompetence confirmed. Patient shows significant signs of dementia. Recommended immediate guardianship transfer. Fee for service, $10,000. Payment to be completed upon signature of commitment papers. I sat back just as I heard their muffled voices through the wall. David sounded ecstatic. He was whispering about how soon the house would be listed and how the banks would have no choice but to listen to them. I had the photo. I had the motive. I had the proof of professional corruption. I had everything I needed to burn their entire operation to the ground. They were so busy counting my money that they had completely forgotten to check the structural integrity of their own conspiracy. They thought they had an easy mark. They were about to learn that they had walked straight into a trap I had been building since the moment I stepped back into that basement. I looked at the photograph on my phone screen. The ink seemed to glow with the promise of justice. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel the weight of my 70 years. I felt a cold, clear engineering precision. I was about to show them exactly what happens when you try to demolish a foundation that is stronger than you could ever comprehend. I waited for the door to open. I was ready to play my part. I was ready to be the confused old man right up until the moment I pulled the lever that would collapse their world. I waited until the house was swallowed by the silence of the early morning before I pulled out my phone. My fingers were steady as I attached the photo of the doctor's bribery note and sent it directly to Stephen Foster. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen until it confirmed delivery. It was done. The evidence was in the hands of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle the Montgomery family, piece by piece. I deleted the sent message and wiped the history. I was ready to play my part. I returned to my room and lay in the dark, breathing in the smell of the house I had built. It was a familiar scent, but tonight it felt like a cage I had to escape from, not through force, but through patience. I walked out of my room when the sun was high enough to cast long, tired shadows across the hardwood floor. My performance began the moment I stepped into the hallway. I let my shoulders slump forward, creating the illusion of a man defeated by his own confusion. I made sure my steps were uneven, a slight drag in my left foot that suggested a lack of coordination. I found David and Rachel sitting in the kitchen, their heads bent together over a stack of documents. They looked up as I entered, and I immediately averted my eyes, pretending to be distracted by a smudge on the wall. David stood up, his face carefully composed, to look like the face of a concerned, dutiful son. He cleared his throat and gestured for me to sit down. "Dad, we need to talk," he said. His voice was patronizingly gentle, the tone one uses with a child or someone they expect to be simple-minded. "We have been thinking about your safety. You have been wandering off, getting confused, and we are worried that you might get hurt." I sat down slowly, letting out a long, shaky breath. I looked at the table, my hands resting tremulously in my lap. I did not look at them. Rachel joined in, her voice dripping with a sweetness that I knew was as artificial as her concern. "We are doing this because we love you, George. We just think it is better if we keep your car keys and your credit cards for a while. We want to make sure you are safe until the doctor arrives tomorrow to check on you." I looked up at them, then keeping my expression vacant and damp with feigned tears. I let a single tear roll down my cheek, a small price to pay for the control they thought they were seizing. "If that is what you think is best," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "I do not want to be a burden. I do not want to be the reason anything goes wrong." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keys and my wallet. I placed them on the table, my hand trembling just enough to make the metal keys clatter against the wood. David reached out and took them, his fingers closing around them with a speed that betrayed his greed. He did not look at me with empathy. He looked at me with the triumph of a man who had finally disarmed his enemy. "That is the right thing to do, Dad," he said, his voice stiff. "We are going to take good care of you." I nodded, maintaining my facade, and spent the rest of the afternoon sitting in the armchair by the window. I watched them move through the house with a new sense of ownership. They had discarded the thin veil of respect they usually showed me. Now they walked with the swagger of people who had already spent the money from the house sale. They did not even bother to lower their voices anymore. They spoke about selling the antique grandfather clock in the hall and how much they could get for the dining room set. They discussed the house as if I were already gone, as if I were just a ghost haunting a property they were ready to flip for a quick profit. I listened to every word, absorbing their plans for my life and my legacy. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a sharp, singular vibration. I waited until I was sure they were busy in the kitchen before I slid the device out. It was a message from Stephen Foster. I opened it and felt the blood run cold in my veins. The report was more damning than I had anticipated. The Montgomery Company had not just been struggling. It had been officially bankrupt for 2 years. They were living on credit loans and the blind faith of investors they had been swindling for months, and the $500,000 they had just withdrawn from my house. It had been wired immediately to a high-interest account, controlled by an infamous group of black market loan sharks. My children were not just greedy, they were desperate. They were being hunted by people who did not care about legal documents or family ties. They had bet my life and my home on a gamble that had already failed, and now they were looking for a way out. They needed to sell the house to survive, but they were running out of time. My son and his wife were not just thieves, they were prey. The realization settled in my chest, heavy and cold. I had planned to teach them a lesson, to crush their pride and expose their greed, but now the stakes were far higher. They were drowning, and they were trying to drag me down to the bottom of the ocean with them. I needed to move faster. I needed to make sure that when the collapse finally came, it was their own hands that pulled the structure down around their heads. I stared at the blank wall, keeping my face void of emotion as I began to calculate the timing for the final act of this play. They thought they had secured their future. They had no idea that I had just signed their death warrant. The digital report from Stephen Foster illuminated my desk like a cold and unforgiving star. I spent the remainder of the night tracing the lines of the Montgomery family fortune and found only a hollow shell. They were not merely struggling, they were an absolute disaster. Richard Montgomery had been bankrupt for 2 years. His company was a graveyard of broken promises and unpaid invoices. The $500,000 he had squeezed out of my home equity was not being used for European expansion or business development. It had been funneled directly into the accounts of loan sharks to satisfy debts that had been compounding in the shadows for months. The realization settled into my gut with the weight of a stone. They were not predators. They were desperate animals running toward a cliff, and they expected me to be the ground that caught them. I closed my laptop and felt a strange calm wash over me. My position had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer the prey who had been outmaneuvered by the cleverness of my own son. I was the master of their financial fate. I picked up my secure phone and dialed the number for my private bank. I was connected to the manager who had served me for over a decade. I gave him the details of the shell company I had set up weeks ago. I authorized the transfer of funds. It was a cold and clinical transaction. I was purchasing the debts of the Montgomery family from the loan sharks. I was becoming the sole entity to whom they owed their miserable existence. The transaction was finalized before the sun began to peek over the horizon. I was now Richard Montgomery's creditor. I owned the paper that dictated whether he stayed in that house or ended up on the street. He did not know it. He still thought he was the one holding the hammer. When I walked back into the living room that afternoon, I felt a renewed sense of clarity. The air in the house seemed to shift. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the chandelier took on a new meaning. I was the silent landlord of their entire facade. Richard was standing by the fireplace arguing with David about the catering arrangements for the upcoming gala. His voice was full of that familiar false confidence. He was planning to invite a dozen wealthy associates to my house, under the guise of an exclusive investment opportunity. He believed that with a few glasses of champagne and a rehearsed pitch about his imaginary expansion, he could swindle enough cash to bridge his debts for another month. He was looking at my living room as if it were his own showroom. He was planning to use the very home he tried to steal from me as the backdrop for the final act of his fraud. I sat in my usual corner and watched them. They were like children playing with matches in a room full of gasoline. David glanced at me and his expression darkened for a second. He clearly disliked seeing me sitting there so quiet and so observant. He thought I was barely aware of my own name. He thought I was a crumbling ruin that would be gone by the end of the week. He did not know that I was the one who had just purchased the leash around his neck. Richard looked up and caught my eye. He did not see a man who owned his debts. He saw an old man who needed to be shuffled out of the way. "We are planning a little get-together tomorrow evening," George Richard said with a smug smile. "We have some important people coming over to discuss the future of the company. It would be best if you spent the evening in your room. We do not want you to get overwhelmed by the noise and the crowd." I nodded slowly. I let my mouth hang open just a fraction. I let my eyes glaze over as if I were struggling to keep up with the conversation. "I want to be helpful," I whispered in a voice that trembled on purpose. "I do not want to cause any trouble." David shot a look of triumph at Richard. He thought he had successfully managed his father. He thought he had secured his obedience just as he had secured his estate. He had no idea that I was granting his request because it served my agenda perfectly. A party with wealthy guests was exactly what I needed. It would provide the perfect audience for the truth. When the time came for Richard to stand up and pitch his lies to those investors, I would be there. I would be the silent observer who knew that every promise coming out of his mouth was backed by nothing but the debt I now held. The hours until the gala dragged on. I spent them sitting in my chair, carefully reviewing the details Stephen had sent over. Every liability, every interest rate, every missed payment was now documented in my private files. They were operating on borrowed time and borrowed money. David and Rachel moved through the house with a feverish energy. They were already spending the money they expected to raise the next night. They were laughing about the suits they would buy and the vacations they would take once the deal was signed. It was a macabre comedy. They were planning their escape while I was building the walls around them. I looked at David again. He was practicing his handshake in the mirror of the hallway. He was practicing the smile he would use to extract money from honest people. He looked so much like his mother at that moment that it caused a sharp pain in my chest. But the pain was quickly replaced by the cold satisfaction of the strategy. He had chosen this. He had chosen the path of deceit, and I was simply providing him with the destination. I would not stop his party. I would not interrupt his pitch. I would watch it unfold with the patience of a man who knew exactly how the story ended. I would let him stand in the center of that room and build his castle of lies higher and higher until the very moment I decided to pull the foundation out from under it. Tomorrow, the guests would arrive. Tomorrow, the wine would be poured. Tomorrow, Richard would think he was a titan of industry. And tomorrow, for the first time in his life, he would understand what it meant to truly owe someone everything. The Sunday afternoon air was heavy and filled with the scent of impending rain. I walked up the driveway with the deliberate, uneven gait of a man whose bones were weary and whose mind was beginning to fray at the edges. My shoulders were hunched, and my gaze was fixed firmly on the ground, projecting the image of a defeated soul who had spent the better part of the weekend wandering aimlessly through the park. I stopped at the front porch and let out a long, ragged breath that I hoped sounded like the sigh of a man who no longer understood the world around him. David opened the door before I even had the chance to knock. He did not smile, nor did he offer a hand to help me inside. Instead, he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest, his expression hardening as he watched me struggle to lift my feet over the threshold. "You are finally here," he said, his voice clipped and impatient. "We were worried you had gotten lost again." I didn't answer. I merely stared past him into the foyer, my eyes wide and slightly unfocused. I allowed my mouth to hang open just enough to suggest a loss of cognitive sharpness. Victoria Montgomery emerged from the dining room, her movements fluid and controlled. She wore a silk dress that caught the light, and her smile was as practiced and cold as a winter morning. She moved toward me with a slow, deliberate grace, her hands clasped in front of her. "George, you have given us quite a scare," she said, her tone dripping with a faux affection that set my teeth on edge. "Come, we have everything ready for you. You must be famished after such a long walk." She guided me toward the living room, where the house had been transformed into a cold, clinical gallery of excess. Expensive floral arrangements occupied every table, and the smell of high-end catering hung in the air, clashing with the familiar, comfortable scent of my own home. I allowed her to lead me to an armchair and sat down with a heavy, uncoordinated collapse. I stared at the carpet, murmuring something unintelligible about the trees being greener than I remembered. David and Victoria exchanged a brief, triumphant glance that lasted only a fraction of a second. They thought they had won. They thought the old man in the chair was nothing more than a hollow shell incapable of understanding the words they were about to speak. They began to talk, their voices low and urgent, as if I were not even in the room. They discussed the logistics of the house, the value of the paintings, the timeline for the final sale. I sat in silence, my mind cataloging every deceit, every cold calculation of my son and his mother-in-law. I found myself staring at Richard Montgomery, who had settled onto the sofa with a glass of scotch. He was fiddling with his sleeve, and the light caught the edge of his watch. It was a Rolex, or at least it claimed to be one, but the plating along the rim was worn and uneven, exposing a base metal that gleamed with a dull, sickly gray. It was a counterfeit, just like his business, just like his claim to wealth, just like the very project he was about to pitch to his guests. The sheer magnitude of their deception was almost impressive. They were standing on the edge of an abyss, and yet they spent their time polishing the brass on a sinking ship. I decided it was time to move the pieces on the board. I reached out for the china teacup that Victoria had placed on the small side table near my hand. I gripped it tightly, then allowed my fingers to suddenly twitch and loosen. The cup tipped, spilling the scalding tea across the mahogany table and onto the rug. I gasped a sound that was half gasp and half whimper and began to pat at the mess with shaky, ineffective hands. Rachel saw the spill and immediately froze. She shot a look toward David, a sharp, silent signal of impatience. David exhaled, his face turning into a mask of forced, patronizing patience. He walked over to me, kneeling on the floor to soak up the liquid. "Dad," he said, his voice thick with a fake gentleness that made my skin crawl. "This is exactly what we were afraid of. Your hands are not steady. You are not safe like this." He looked up at Victoria, who was watching with a look of cold, calculating approval. "We will call the specialist," David said, and his eyes searched mine, looking for signs of fear, looking for a protest that never came. "A doctor will be here tomorrow morning for a full evaluation. He will see if you need more structure." He avoided the word nursing home, but we both knew what he meant. I let my head drop to my chest, my shoulders shaking with a sob I had perfected in the silence of my hotel room. I nodded repeatedly, a submissive, broken movement. "If that is what you think is best," I whispered, my voice thick with the simulation of confusion. "I do not want to be a trouble. I do not want to be a burden to anyone." David stood up, his face filled with the sickening relief of a man who has just been handed everything he ever wanted. "We are just doing this because we love you," he lied, and his voice was steady. It was the voice of a man who had already committed the murder of his own father's autonomy. They led me down to the basement, to the small storage area they had cleared out for me. They had moved an old cot down there along with a few boxes of clothes. It was cold and smelled of damp earth and neglect. David held the door open for me, his expression devoid of any remaining pretense. "Stay down here tonight," he said, and he didn't even try to soften his tone. "We have guests coming and we cannot have you wandering around." He stepped out and pulled the door shut. The lock clicked a heavy mechanical sound that signaled my imprisonment. I stood in the darkness, listening to the heavy footsteps moving toward the stairs. They were celebrating already. They were popping corks and laughing about the ease with which they had disposed of me. I waited until the house above settled into the quiet hum of preparation. I moved to the back corner of the basement, to the hidden compartment I had built years ago to store my blueprints. I pushed aside the loose wooden panel and reached deep into the void behind the brickwork. My hand found the cool, hard velvet of a garment bag. I pulled it out and unzipped it. Inside was the navy blue three-piece suit I had worn to my own wedding, a suit I had kept in pristine condition for 3 decades. I stripped off my soiled, pathetic clothes and began to dress. The fabric of the suit was stiff, smelling faintly of cedar and mothballs, but it felt like armor. I buttoned the vest, feeling the weight of the fabric against my ribs. I adjusted the silk tie in the mirror hanging on the back of the door, straightening my posture, pulling my shoulders back, until I felt the iron rigidity of the man I used to be. The confused old man had vanished. In his place stood the structural engineer who had spent 40 years reading the stresses of steel and concrete. I turned my attention to the cellar door. The lock was a simple, cheap deadbolt that David had installed himself. It was a laughable attempt at security. I took a small, sturdy screwdriver from the back of the loose panel. I didn't need to pick the lock. I knew the mechanics of the door frame better than the carpenter who had installed it. I tapped the hinge pins with the handle of the screwdriver, pushing them upward with rhythmic, calculated strikes. The door didn't even creak as it drifted open. I stepped out into the hallway, my shoes silent on the polished wood. I walked toward the stairs, but this time I didn't drag my foot. I didn't hunch my shoulders. I moved with the silent, precise steps of a man who was walking into his own house to reclaim his throne. I stopped at the top of the stairs, listening. The party had begun. The living room was filled with the sounds of laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the shallow, animated chatter of people who thought they were investing in the next big thing. I could hear Richard Montgomery's voice rising above the crowd holding court, with a story about international markets and expansion. I adjusted my tie one last time. I felt the cold, hard weight of the flash drive in my pocket, the one containing every shred of evidence that would end their charade before the night was through. They wanted a show. They wanted to turn my life into a spectacle for their guests. I gave them credit for the effort. But they had forgotten the most basic rule of engineering. You never build a foundation on top of a sinkhole. And tonight, I was going to be the storm that washed it all away. I started down the stairs, and every step I took felt like a hammer striking the final nail into their coffin. They were about to learn that when you try to bury a man alive, you better make sure he doesn't know how to build his way out. The evening air inside the estate was heavy with the cloying scent of expensive lilies and the sharp metallic tang of forced celebration. Every crystal chandelier seemed to vibrate with the sheer volume of superficial chatter. Guests moved through the ballroom like sharks in shallow water, their smiles wide and brittle, their eyes constantly scanning for the next person of influence to corner. They were a collection of sycophants and opportunists, drawn to this house not by friendship, but by the promise of easy wealth and the reflected glory of a man they believed to be a titan. Richard Montgomery stood on the low platform near the fireplace, his silhouette framed by the flickering flames. He looked every bit the success story. He held his champagne glass with the practiced ease of a man born to privilege. His voice boomed across the room, projecting a narrative of international expansion, high-stakes investments, and the boundless future of his corporate empire. He gestured to the house itself, a sweep of his hand encompassing the crown molding and the marble floors, calling it the foundation of his future legacy. The crowd erupted into applause, a sound of collective approval that fueled Richard's already bloated sense of invincibility. He bowed slightly, his grin wide and triumphant, soaking in the admiration of people who were far too intoxicated by the atmosphere to notice that the man leading them was steering them toward a cliff. I watched from the shadows of the arched hallway, unnoticed and unbothered. I felt the sharp texture of the suit fabric against my skin, a reminder that I was no longer the man they thought I was. I felt the cold, hard weight of the flash drive in my breast pocket. It was a weapon more dangerous than any loaded pistol. I took a deep, steadying breath. My heart was not hammering against my ribs. It was keeping time, a slow and rhythmic countdown to the moment I would reclaim everything they had tried to steal. I adjusted my silk tie, ensuring the knot was perfectly centered. I checked the reflection in a darkened window panel nearby. The man staring back at me did not have the vacant, glassy eyes of an Alzheimer's patient. He had the eyes of a wolf who had been waiting for the fence to fall. I turned toward the grand entrance. My movements were no longer the hesitant, shuffling steps of an old man who had lost his way. They were the deliberate, heavy strides of an owner walking through his own halls. I reached the massive oak doors, placed my palms against the cool wood, and pushed with all the strength I had maintained throughout a lifetime of physical work. The doors swung open with a heavy, resounding thud that echoed through the ballroom like a crack of thunder. The music didn't just stop. It felt as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The conversation died, strangled in the throats of the guests. Hundreds of eyes turned simultaneously toward the entrance. They expected to see a senile old man looking for his slippers, or perhaps a confused soul lost in his own home. Instead, they saw a man who looked like he had stepped out of an old portrait, a man of power and quiet, absolute authority. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, allowing the silence to stretch until it became suffocating. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I simply walked into the room, my head held high, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the people I had called my friends and neighbors. I saw David first. He was standing near the buffet table, a half-finished drink in his hand. His fingers spasmed and the glass tilted, spilling amber liquid across his knuckles. He didn't even notice. He was staring at me as if I were a ghost risen from the grave. His face, usually so capable of hiding his true intentions, was now slack and pale. He looked at Victoria, then at Richard, and finally back at me. He was searching for a glimmer of confusion in my eyes, a sign of the man he thought he had successfully broken. He found nothing but cold, hard clarity. Victoria Montgomery, the woman who had spent the last week treating me like a piece of broken furniture, was currently frozen with a napkin halfway to her mouth. She dropped it as if it were burning. Her eyes darted around the room, desperately looking for an exit, looking for a way to restore the image of control she had worked so hard to project. She was the one who had orchestrated the medical evaluation. She was the one who had brought the corrupt doctor into our home. Now she looked like a gambler who had bet her final dollar on a rigged hand and watched the dealer rake it away. Richard was the most pathetic of them all. He remained on the platform, his champagne glass still suspended in midair. He looked down at me from his height, his chest heaving, his mouth slightly parted. He seemed to be waiting for me to stumble, for me to start rambling about the weather, or to forget where I was. But I didn't stumble. I kept walking my pace, steady and rhythmic. I stopped directly in front of the platform and looked up at him. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. I could see the pulse jumping in his neck. I knew he was remembering the debt he owed the one I had silently purchased through my shell company. He was looking at his creditor, the man who held the note on his house, his car, and his very freedom. The guests remained motionless, a tableau of shallow socialites, suddenly aware that the theater production they had paid for had been replaced by a reality they weren't prepared for. They looked at the scene, looking at the contrast between the disheveled, panicking Richard on the stage and the composed, commanding figure I presented. They sensed that a shift had occurred, a tectonic movement in the social order of the room. I felt the weight of their attention. I felt the shift in power. For the first time in months, the house felt like mine again. Not because I had forced them to admit it, but because I had reclaimed the presence of the owner. David tried to move toward me, to intercept me before I could say anything, but I simply glanced at him, a sharp, dismissive movement of my eyes, and he stopped as if I had struck him. He knew better. He knew the look. It was the look of a man who had finally seen through every layer of his deception. I didn't look back at the room. I didn't look at the expensive flowers or the stolen food. I kept my eyes on Richard, who was slowly lowering his glass, his hand shaking so violently the crystal rattled against his teeth. He knew. He didn't know how, he didn't know when, but he knew that the game had changed. He knew he was no longer the predator. He was the prey. And I was the one who had set the boundaries of his cage. I stood there, savoring the sound of the silence, a symphony more beautiful than any music they could have played. I was the master of the house, and the night was only just beginning. The guests stood paralyzed, their glasses and plates forgotten, as the reality of the situation began to settle in. It was a beautiful, quiet moment of realization. They were realizing that the man they had mocked, the man they had dismissed as a relic of a dying past, was the only one in the room with any true substance. They saw the suit, the posture, the cold, steady gaze, and they understood. They understood that the Montgomery family was not the center of this universe. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of impending judgment. Every one of them was an accomplice to the facade, and now they were all standing in the light of an exposed secret. I felt the power of the truth radiating from my presence. I was the architect of their downfall, and I was exactly where I needed to be. The stage was mine now. The script was mine, and the next act would be the one they would remember for the rest of their short, miserable lives. I didn't smile. I didn't smirk. I maintained a face of stern, immovable purpose. I was the man who had built this life, and I was the man who would take it back brick by brick, lie by lie. Zidao, the truth, stood tall among the ruins of their greed. I turned slowly to the crowd, my expression neutral and terrifyingly calm. I had come to witness a business pitch, hadn't I? I should hear what Richard had to say about his imaginary empire. I was the one who owned the debt, after all. It was only fair I listened to the proposal. I stepped closer to the platform, my boots tapping on the floor, with a sound like iron on stone. Every movement was deliberate, every breath controlled. I was the calm in the eye of the hurricane I was about to unleash. And as I looked at the panicked, sweating, hollow men and women before me, I knew that this night would end not with the signing of a contract, but with the total collapse of their hollow world. I was ready. The curtain was rising, and the play was finally, mercifully, turning into the tragedy they deserved. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a vacuum that seemed to pull the very oxygen from the air. The chatter of the elite guests died instantly, replaced by the sound of my own footsteps against the polished hardwood floor. I did not hurry. Every stride was measured, confident, and filled with the weight of someone who knew exactly who he was. I felt the eyes of every person in the room upon me. They were not looking at a frail old man anymore. They were looking at an intruder who carried himself with the quiet, terrifying authority of an owner returning to his estate. David was the first to break the stillness. His face was a contorted mask of panic, his skin drained of all color. He moved with a desperate, frantic energy, rushing toward me, as if he could physically intercept the truth before it was spoken. He reached for my arm, his fingers clawing at the expensive fabric of my suit jacket. He wanted to pull me back into the shadows of the basement, back to the prison he had constructed for me. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at him with the anger he so richly deserved. I simply lifted my arm and brushed his hand away with the calm indifference one might use to flick a speck of dust from a sleeve. David stumbled back, his eyes wide, finally understanding that the dynamic of our relationship had been irrevocably shattered. I continued toward this platform. The murmurs began like a low tide rising in a quiet bay. Heads turned as the realization spread through the crowd like a contagion. There were developers, bankers, and high-profile architects scattered throughout the room, and I saw the recognition flicker in their eyes. They remembered me. They remembered the blueprints I had drafted and the steel skeletons I had raised in the heart of this city. I was not the confused shadow they had been told about. I was the ghost of their own professional history, a man whose name was once synonymous with structural integrity. Richard Montgomery stood frozen at the podium, his champagne glass wobbling in his hand. The liquid splashed over his knuckles, yet he seemed unable to feel the cold sting of the alcohol. I stopped at the base of the platform and looked him directly in the eye. I did not need to ask for the microphone. I simply reached out and took it from his trembling grasp. The feedback was a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the tension, but I held the device with a hand as steady as a surgeon. Richard looked down at me, his mouth slightly parted in a silent, desperate prayer. He was waiting for me to falter, waiting for the familiar fog of confusion to descend upon my features, but he found nothing but a cold, hard clarity. I turned to the audience, my gaze sweeping across the room with the precision of a hawk. "Your attention, please," I said, and my voice was a resonant baritone that filled every corner of the ballroom. "You have been listening to a story about a future built on foundations of gold and steel. But I think it is time you heard the truth about the present reality of your host." Richard tried to step forward, his face flushed with a mixture of terror and rage, but he could not find the words to silence me. The crowd leaned in a collective hunger for scandal etched into their faces. They were no longer cheering for a visionary. They were waiting to see a fraud collapse. Rachel erupted. Her shriek was a jagged sound that tore through the decorum of the evening, hitting a register that shattered the final remnants of the gala's charm. She demanded that security remove me. She screamed that I was a sick man, that I was having an episode, that I was a danger to myself and everyone present. Her voice was frantic, desperate, and shrill. She was trying to shout over the truth, but the more she screamed, the more the guests distanced themselves from her. They watched her with a mixture of embarrassment and morbid curiosity. The hired security guards hesitated, moving forward and then stopping uncertain. They looked at the elegant man in the blue suit who stood before them with more power than the man who had signed their paychecks. The double doors at the main entrance swung open once more with a heavy, resounding thud. This time the entrance was not for a guest. It was for the law. Stephen Foster stepped through, his face set in a grim, immovable line. He did not look like a man who had come for cocktails. He looked like an executioner arriving to finish a task. Behind him, two men in dark, nondescript suits moved with the efficient, predatory grace of federal agents. The air in the room became even thinner. The guests huddled together, pressing against the walls, creating a wide circle of empty space around the Montgomery family. David fell to his knees near the buffet table, his head buried in his hands. He knew. He realized that the debt I had purchased, the records I had uncovered, and the authorities now standing in the foyer, meant that the game was not just over. It had never really been a game. I looked at the people in the room, the sycophants and the opportunists. I saw their masks slipping, their carefully cultivated indifference replaced by raw fear. They had come here to toast to a new empire, but they were witnessing the demolition of a ruin. I turned back to the microphone, feeling the power of the moment settle over my shoulders like a heavy golden cloak. "You see, Richard," I said, and my voice was softer now, all the more dangerous for its quiet. "A structure built on deceit will always fall. It is not a matter of if, but a matter of when, and tonight the time has run out." The agents moved forward, their presence immediate and unavoidable. The party was not just ending, it was being dismantled. I looked down at the platform, at the man who had tried to steal my life and my legacy. He looked small. He looked diminished. He looked like exactly what he was. A man who had gambled everything on a lie and lost. The silence of the ballroom was finally broken by the cold metallic click of handcuffs being fastened behind Richard Montgomery's back. It was the only sound that mattered. I had come to watch the show, but I ended up being the only one holding the script. I stood my ground, a man who had reclaimed his territory, a man who would never be considered a burden again. The performance was over, and the truth had finally taken the stage. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a vacuum that seemed to pull the very oxygen from the air. I looked at the crowd. Not a single person dared to whisper. I tapped the microphone lightly. The sound was clean and crisp. I did not need to shout. I let the truth do the work for me. I began with the numbers. I read them from the file Stephen had handed me, my voice steady and devoid of the confusion I had feigned for so long. $500,000. That was the sum pulled from the equity of my home. It had vanished. It did not go to business expansion or new projects, as Richard had promised you all tonight. It went to satisfy the sharks who were waiting in the shadows to collect on debts that had been compounding for years. The room shifted. The atmosphere was no longer one of celebration, but of cold, hard judgment. I spoke of the doctor next. I spoke of a man of medicine who sold his integrity for $10,000. The fee was for a signature on a document declaring me mentally incompetent. A simple, neat transaction. My freedom, my life, and my legacy were worth precisely that amount to them. I gestured to Stephen. He began to move. He walked down the aisle of guests with the measured steps of a man delivering final notices. He placed copies of the official bankruptcy filings on their laps. He handed over the bank records that showed the desperate, frantic wire transfers to offshore accounts that no longer held a single penny. The murmurs began. They were low at first, like the distant rumble of an approaching storm, then sharp, then angry. I looked at the faces of the people who had been applauding moments ago. The excitement had evaporated. It was replaced by a distinct, sharp-edged disgust. These were people who worshipped wealth and success, but they despised being cheated. They felt the cold realization that their own investments were not just at risk, but already gone. Victoria Montgomery's face went white. She did not scream. She did not argue. She simply folded into herself, her eyes rolling back as she slipped to the floor. It was a quiet, almost graceful collapse. No one rushed to catch her. The guests stood back, creating a ring around her slumped form. They watched her with a mixture of confusion and morbid fascination, the way one watches a car crash in slow motion. Richard remained on the platform, his champagne glass now forgotten on the podium. His face, once the picture of arrogant success, was now a portrait of terror. He realized the trap had closed. He bolted for the side exit, his movements erratic and frantic. He was fast, but the two men in dark suits were faster. They moved with quiet, professional intent. They intercepted him before he could reach the heavy velvet curtains of the exit. They did not raise their voices. They simply blocked his path and pinned his arms behind his back with practiced ease. I turned back to the microphone. The room was deathly quiet again, waiting for the final blow. "Evans is already talking," I said to the silent ballroom. "He told the federal agents everything this morning. He gave them the dates, the names, and the exact locations of the offshore accounts. The web is already caught. You are not holding an investment gala, Richard. You are holding a wake for your own criminal career." The guests were no longer just listeners. They were witnesses to a collapse. A few of them stood up, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. They looked at the documents in their hands as if they were evidence of their own foolishness. They had been eager to pour their money into a sinking ship, and now they were desperate to get off before the water rose any higher. I saw a prominent real estate investor throw his champagne glass into a fountain. I saw a banker clutching his chest as he reread the bankruptcy papers. They were realizing that their reputation, their connections, and their portfolios were all tied to the Montgomery name, a name that was now radioactive. I looked down at Richard, who was struggling against the grip of the federal agents. He was not looking at the guests. He was looking at me, his eyes wide, full of a realization that he had underestimated the very man he thought he had conquered. He had played a game of chess with a man who had been building the board his entire life. David was still on the floor near the buffet table, shivering. He was not looking at anyone. He had tried to hide in the shadows, but the light had found him too. He was the junior partner in this tragedy, the one who had been promised a cut of the spoils that never existed. He had traded his father for a mirage. The federal agents were calm. They did not make a scene. They simply guided Richard toward the main entrance, his struggle becoming weaker with every step. The guests moved out of their way, creating a path, their faces a blur of shock and indignation. They were the elite of this city, the people who thought they were immune to such consequences, and they were learning tonight that even the highest towers fall when the foundation is rot. I stepped off the platform and walked toward the door. I had no reason to stay. The show was over, and the ending was exactly as I had scripted it. I saw Stephen standing near the entrance, his face as unreadable as ever. He nodded to me, a silent acknowledgement of a job well done. We had done what was necessary. We had reclaimed the truth. As I passed by the spot where Victoria had fallen, she was beginning to stir, her eyes blinking open, looking around in a haze of confusion and shame. She would have to answer for her actions, just like the rest of them. I did not stop. I did not offer a hand or a word of comfort. There was no comfort for people who had chosen this path. I reached the doors and pushed them open. The cold night air hit my face, refreshing and clean. It felt like the first real breath I had taken in months. I walked down the driveway, the gravel crunching under my expensive shoes. Behind me, the house I had built, the house they had tried to turn into a tomb for me, was now a crime scene. I had walked through the fire they set, and I had come out the other side. The story of the Montgomery family would be written tomorrow in the newspapers, in the courtrooms, and in the private conversations of every investor who had lost their fortune. And I would be the one who decided the tone of that story. I walked to the waiting car at the end of the driveway, the engine running, ready to take me away from the ruins of their greed. I did not look back. I had left the past behind me in that ballroom, and I was ready for whatever came next. The silence that descended upon the ballroom after Richard Montgomery was led away was heavy and suffocating. It was not the peaceful quiet of reflection, but the tense, jagged stillness that precedes a total collapse. David Montgomery stood in the center of the room, his face a sickly shade of gray. His composure had entirely disintegrated. He looked at the federal agents departing, and then frantically turned his gaze toward Rachel and his mother-in-law. His hands were shaking with such violence that his cufflinks rattled against his wrists. "It was not my fault," David shouted. His voice was a thin, high-pitched fracture in the air. He pointed a trembling finger at the women. "You pushed me into this from the very beginning. You said the leverage was safe. You told me the expansion was guaranteed. I was just the instrument for your greed." He was not a man anymore. He was a cornered animal desperate to tear apart anyone nearby if it could buy him an extra second of freedom. Rachel did not shrink away. She stepped forward, her expensive gown rustling like dry leaves. She looked at David not with love or sympathy, but with the cold, sharp eyes of a predator. "You coward," she hissed. "You were the one who signed the ledgers. You were the one who walked into the bank and lied to their faces about the company valuation. Do not dare try to make me the scapegoat for your pathetic lack of vision." The vitriol flowed between them, sharp and unrelenting. They traded accusations like blows, their voices rising as they clawed at one another in a desperate bid to absolve themselves of the ruin. They blamed the lawyers, they blamed the consultants, and eventually they blamed each other with a viciousness that left no room for dignity. It was a grotesque display of self-preservation. I stood back, my hands folded neatly behind my back, watching the wreckage. I did not move. I did not intervene. I watched my son with a detached, clinical eye. I looked at the man he had become and tried to see the child who once took his very first uncertain steps in this hallway. That child was gone. The boy who had once laughed with genuine wonder at the world had been consumed by the man who valued power above integrity. There was no grief left in me, only a cold, hard finality. He was a failed structure, a flawed design that had finally buckled under the weight of his own hubris. I walked toward them, my presence cutting through their shouting like a sharp blade. The air grew still once again. David saw me coming and tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to shout to be heard. I simply reached into my inner pocket and withdrew the thick cream-colored manila folder I had been holding since I left the cellar. I held it out toward him. David stared at the document as if it were a coiled viper. "Take it," I said. My voice was steady and calm, echoing in the vast, empty ballroom. David hesitantly reached out and took the folder. His fingers brushed against my own for a split second, and I felt the cold sweat on his skin. He opened the file and began to read. His eyes scanned the first page, the second, and the third. With every line he read, his color faded even further until he looked like a statue carved from ash. "What is this?" he whispered. His voice was no longer a shout. It was the sound of a man drowning. "You know what it is," I replied. "It is the ledger of your life for the past 2 years. I am now the owner of the debt you so foolishly traded away to the sharks in the dark. Every loan you took, every fraudulent note you signed has been purchased by my holding company. I am your sole creditor." The room was silent enough to hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hall. David let the folder slip from his fingers, and the papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. He looked at me with eyes that were hollow, filled with the terrifying realization of his situation. He was no longer just in trouble with the law. He was indebted to the man he had tried to destroy. I looked down at him and felt no satisfaction, only the cold, clear truth of a balance sheet being settled. "You have 30 days to settle the principal," I said, my tone indifferent, as if I were discussing the weather. "After that, interest accumulates at the rate we agreed upon with your previous lenders, only now I am the one setting the terms. If you fail to meet the obligation, I will seize the assets. All of them. This house, the cars, the accounts, everything that was used to secure your lies." David crumpled to the floor, his knees hitting the marble with a sickening thud. He began to sob, not the tears of a man who felt remorse, but the whimpering of a man who realized he had lost his leverage. He was an empty vessel, a man who had sold his soul for a kingdom that never truly existed. I turned away from him, satisfied. The play was over, and the ending was exactly as it had to be. I looked at the guests, many of whom were still watching, their eyes wide with the realization that they were witnessing the fall of a family they had envied just an hour before. I did not ask for their sympathy. I did not care for their judgment. I simply adjusted my cuffs and walked toward the door, leaving them in the ruins they had helped build. The power had shifted back to where it belonged, not in the hands of the greedy, but in the hands of the one who had the patience to wait for the storm to clear. As I stepped out into the night, I heard David wailing for his wife, for his mother, for anyone to save him, but there was no one left to answer. I kept walking, leaving the ghost of the man I used to be and the man my son had tried to destroy far behind me in the dark. The federal agents did not waste a second. Their arrival was not a disruption, but a systematic dismantling of the charade. They moved through the room with the clinical detachment of surgeons. Before the last echoes of my ultimatum could fade, they had already moved to the buffet table where the fine china and crystal were still set for a dinner that would never be served. The lead agent pulled out a series of documents, and with a voice that cut through the thick air of the ballroom, announced the immediate freeze of all Montgomery assets. The shock on the faces of the guests was profound. They were investors and socialites who lived their lives in the world of high-value transactions, but they had never seen one end with the immediate chilling reality of a federal seizure. Richard and Rachel were led toward the foyer. The man who had stood on the platform moments ago preaching about the future of his empire was now reduced to a stumbling figure with his hands bound by cold, unforgiving steel. Rachel did not go quietly. She screamed curses that were ugly and desperate, her voice cracking as she lashed out at Richard and her own parents, who stood nearby in terrified silence. She accused them of orchestrating the entire collapse, of forcing her into the fraud, of ruining her social standing. Her accusations were a frantic, pathetic attempt to separate her fate from his, but it was too late. The law did not care about her excuses. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars outside began to dance against the grand windows of the ballroom, painting the room in a strobe of guilt and retribution. The guests could not escape the scene fast enough. They gathered their coats and scrambled for the exits, their movements hurried and clumsy. They were terrified that if they stayed a moment longer, they would be implicated by association. As they shuffled past me, they did not offer a word. They did not try to make eye contact. They were cowards who had worshipped at the altar of Montgomery prestige, and now they were terrified of the debris of its fall. They stared at their shoes, their faces flushed with shame, afraid that the invisible power I held might somehow touch them too. I watched them flee, my hands still clasped behind my back. I felt no pity for them. They were the ones who had been willing to invest in a lie as long as it padded their own pockets. Now they were left with nothing but the memory of their own greed. In the center of the room, David stood completely alone. The chaos of the arrests, the shouting of his wife, and the exodus of the guests had left him stranded in the middle of the empty marble floor. He looked around as if he had just woken from a long, feverish dream. He turned to me, his eyes wide and pleading. He expected me to shout at him. He expected me to drag him out to the police and have him cuffed alongside his brother-in-law. He expected the violence of a confrontation. I did none of those things. I walked toward him, my steps echoing against the cold floor. I stopped just a few feet away from him. He was trembling, his clothes disheveled, his confidence completely obliterated. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the folder that Stephen Foster had prepared for me. I held it out to him, but I did not drop it. I let him take it with his own shaking hands. He opened it and saw the legal notice. He was the owner of the debt now. He was responsible for the hundreds of thousands of dollars that his father had swindled. He was the primary debtor. I did not file a police report against you. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it sounded like a roar in the quiet room. I did not need to. You are already in a prison far more permanent than any cell. He looked at the papers, his lips moving as he read the crushing numbers. He understood what I was telling him. I had bought his debt. I was his landlord, his lender, his owner. If he wanted to walk out of this house, he had to pay me. If he wanted to eat, he had to pay me. If he wanted a life, he had to pay me. You are not going to jail, David, I continued. Jail is for those who commit crimes and serve their time. But you are going to live in the ruins. Every cent you earn for the next decade will flow through my accounts. You are not a son anymore. You are a contractor for your own survival. I watched the horror dawn on him. He had anticipated the law. He had feared the handcuffs. But he had never contemplated this fate. He had wanted the inheritance, and I had given him the burden. He had wanted to control my house, so now he had to manage the debt of my house. He stood there, completely undone, surrounded by the remnants of the party, with no money, no wife, no status, and a father who had decided he was not even worth the effort of a criminal trial. I turned my back on him. I had no more words. I walked out the front door, leaving the house, the debt, and the boy who had once been my son in the silence of the room he had helped wreck. The sirens outside were fading, replaced by the cool, quiet breath of the night air. I breathed in deeply. It was the air of a man who had successfully cleared the landscape of weeds. I had settled the accounts. I had reclaimed the structure of my life. And tomorrow I would begin to build something real, something that would last. The drama was over, and the house, now truly mine, stood silent and empty, waiting for the peace I had finally earned. I did not look back. There was nothing left in that room worth remembering. The silence that settled into the house was total and absolute. The frantic wail of sirens had faded into the distance, and the footsteps of the final federal agents had been swallowed by the night. I stood alone in the center of the ballroom, where hours ago the air had been thick with the scent of ambition and expensive cologne. Now the space was merely an echo chamber of hollow opulence. The abandoned crystal glasses and the half-eaten hors d'oeuvres on the silver trays looked like the discarded remains of a civilization that had collapsed overnight. I felt a strange sense of clarity standing there amidst the wreckage. The house, which had been a stage for the Montgomery charade, was finally quiet. The static and the noise of the deception had been scrubbed clean. David was still on the floor. He had not moved since the agents led Richard and Rachel away. He was curled into a small knot, his forehead pressed against the cold marble as if he were trying to hide from the very air of the room. He was a pathetic sight. His clothes were damp with perspiration, and the frantic energy that had fueled his arrogance was gone. He looked less like a man, and more like a ghost of the person I had once attempted to raise. He began to weep. It was a jagged, ugly sound that tore through the stillness of the room. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my trousers with a desperate, clawing grip. "Father, please," he gasped. His voice was raw and broken. "I did not know. I never knew the scale of the fraud. They manipulated me. They fed me lies and told me that everything was under control. I was just a puppet. I was just doing what they told me to do." He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and swollen, searching my face for a flicker of the old man. He remembered the man he thought he could leverage for pity. He wanted me to act as the shield I had been for so many years. He wanted me to pick him up, to dust him off, and to find a way to make the consequences disappear. I looked down at him. My face felt like stone. There was no rage left in me to fuel a shout. I simply reached down and placed a hand on his chin, forcing him to look at me. His skin was cold. I did not see a victim. I saw a man who had spent his entire life waiting for a handout. I saw a man who had never once stood on his own 2 feet because he had been too busy standing on mine. "You were never a puppet," I said. My voice was steady and carried a weight that made him flinch. "A puppet has no will. You had every opportunity to question the ledgers. You had every chance to look at the numbers and realize they were written in blood and deceit. You chose to close your eyes because you preferred the comfort of the lie over the work of the truth. You are not a victim of their manipulation. You are a willing beneficiary of it." David sobbed harder, his grip on my pant leg tightening. "I am your son," he wailed. "Please, I will do anything. Give me another chance. I will start over. I will fix this." I stared at him and felt a profound, aching sadness. Not for his fate, but for the realization that there was nothing inside him to work with. He was a hollow man, a vessel of entitlement that had never learned the grit of reality. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out a key, the heavy brass key to the front door, and dropped it into his palm. Then I gestured to the corner of the room, where I had placed a small, nondescript suitcase earlier that evening. It contained nothing but the basics: no luxuries, no inheritance, no safety net. I walked over and pushed the suitcase toward him with the toe of my shoe. "You are leaving," I said. My voice brooked no argument. "You will not stay in this house, you will not draw from my accounts, and you will not hide behind my name any longer. You wanted to be a man of independence, David. You wanted the power that came with the Montgomery fortune. Now you will have the chance to earn it. You will walk out that door, and you will never return until you have built a life that is entirely your own. I am stripping you of every advantage you have ever used as a crutch." David stared at the suitcase as if it were a bomb. He looked at the door, then back at me, his mouth agape. "But I have nowhere to go," he whispered. "I have no money. I have no connections. What am I supposed to do?" He sounded like a child who had been told the candy shop was closing forever. "You are going to do exactly what I did," I replied. "You are going to find a job that pays by the hour. You are going to learn what it feels like to worry about rent and food. You are going to find out who you really are when your name is not backed by a fortune. If you are as capable as you claimed to be when you were stealing from the business, then you will survive. If not, then you will learn what life is like for the people you and your brother-in-law spent years stepping on." I walked to the front door and pulled it wide open. The night air rushed in, smelling of pine and damp earth. It was a clean, sharp scent that promised nothing but the reality of the world outside. David stood up slowly. He looked at the vastness of the empty ballroom, the grand staircase, the portraits of ancestors he had tried to exploit. He looked like a man who had been cast out of paradise. He took the suitcase and stumbled toward the door, his shoulders hunched in defeat. He did not look back. He did not say goodbye. He simply vanished into the darkness of the driveway, a man suddenly confronted with a world he had never actually seen. I slammed the door shut. The sound was a definitive thunderous report that signaled the end of an era. The lock clicked into place with a mechanical finality. I turned around and walked into the kitchen. I did not rush. I enjoyed the sound of my own footsteps on the marble. It was a sound that belonged only to me now. I went to the pantry and retrieved a bottle of my favorite aged whiskey. I did not need ice. I did not need a toast to anything or anyone. I poured a single measure into a heavy crystal glass and stepped over to the counter. I watched the golden liquid swirl as I held it up to the light. The room was perfectly still. There was no more screaming, no more threats, no more frantic planning. The rot had been cut out, and the structure was finally stable again. I took a sip and let the warmth spread through my chest. The chaos of the last few months had been a necessary fire, burning away everything that was fake and leaving only the bedrock of my own integrity. I was the architect of my life once more, and for the first time in a long time, the floor beneath me felt solid. The house was quiet, and in that quiet, I finally found the peace I had been fighting to regain. I looked at the dark windows, knowing that outside the world would soon learn the truth, but inside I was already moving on. The parasites were gone, and the master of the house was home to stay. The story of George and David highlights a difficult but essential truth. True strength cannot be inherited, nor can it be sustained through dependency. When we provide a safety net that shields our loved ones from the consequences of their actions, we do not nurture them. We enable their stagnation. Real growth begins only when an individual is forced to face the reality of their own choices. By severing the ties of financial reliance, George did not act out of malice, but out of a profound need to restore his own integrity and offer his son a chance at authentic maturity. If this story of reclaiming one's life and setting boundaries resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below.